Welcome everyone to the CINA Distinguished Speaker Series. I am Jim Jones, the Director of CINA. CINA is a DHS Center of Excellence for Criminal Investigations and Network Analysis based at George Mason University. A gentle reminder for our attendees to please mute your microphones during the talk if you are connecting via Zoom. The talk is also being streamed via YouTube. One final note before we begin. Our next distinguished speaker will be Lindsay Roberson from the Human Trafficking Institute on Tuesday, December 7th. Details, videos of past talks, events, and other information and resources are available at the CINA website, cina.gmu.edu. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today, Dr. Marie Tillyer. Dr. Tillyer is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her work focuses on violence, victimization, and the spatial distribution of crime. She is co-author of a forthcoming book titled School Zone, a problem analysis of student offending and victimization. Her past research has examined community supervision outcomes, violence reduction, crime analysis, and human trafficking. Much of her research is informed by an environmental criminological perspective that examines crime events in the immediate spatiotemporal circumstances in which they occur. Dr. Tillyer's talk today is based on some of her recent research and is titled Place-Based Improvements for Public Safety, Public Regulation, Private Investment, and Changes in Crime at Microplaces Across 6 U.S. Cities. Marie, welcome to CINA and the Distinguished Speaker Series, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for having us. We really appreciate this opportunity to share our research with you all. I'm Marie Tillyer. I'm from the University of Texas at San Antonio, Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Rebecca Walter and Arthur Acklin. They're from the Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. So as you can see, we're a very interdisciplinary research team. So our work is influenced by criminology, real estate, and urban planning perspectives. And what I'll be presenting on today is part of a 2-year CINA-funded project that was focused on spatiotemporal crime pattern detection. And today we're going to focus on a specific aspect of that in the role of place-based improvements for public safety. All right. So just to give you an overview of what the presentation will look like, I'll start by giving you some background information on what we know from about 30 years of research on spatiotemporal crime patterns, and then briefly discuss how criminologists and other scholars have come to understand these distribution. What accounts for differences of crime across places? Why are some locations at risk for crime? From there, I'll introduce this idea of place-based improvements for crime reduction. And in particular, our research today is really highlighted on 2 potential mechanisms. One is public regulation in the form of municipal code enforcement. And the second is private investment in the form of building permit activity. And so with our research, we're examining year-to-year changes in crime at street segments within 6 US cities. And I'll talk more about this idea of street segments and the importance of looking at really small spatial units. I'll talk about the data and methods and findings from our research, and then we'll wrap up with a discussion and what does this mean for crime prevention within cities, as well as give you an indication of where we're planning on going with research in this area. So let's get started. So we know from an established set of research findings from the past 30 years that crime tends to be spatially concentrated at relatively few microplaces. This is what Weisbord has called the law of crime concentration. And so despite our historical focus on really trying to understand differences across neighborhoods, what this area of research has shown us is that there's a lot of within neighborhood variation. In other words, even in communities that have the reputation of being unsafe, you'll have street to street differences. So some streets that tend to have lots of crime could be co-located next to streets that have very little crime. And so Just to give you an idea of what this looks like, the sort of seminal work in this area was done by Sherman and colleagues in Minneapolis, where they found that just 3.3% of addresses and intersections accounted for about 50% of calls for service to the police in a given year. More recently, Weisberg and colleagues found that just 4.5% of street segments in Seattle accounted for about half of all crimes in the city from 1989 to 2002. So aside from the public safety concerns, there's also research coming out, some of it by Weisberg and colleagues, that these high crime microplaces are often correlated with lots of physical and mental health consequences. And so even though the mechanisms between these harms is still being unpacked by researchers, it seems like interventions that could simultaneously address public safety concerns, as well as some of these health and economic concerns, are really worthy of further investigation. So what else do we know about spatiotemporal crime patterns? Well, they tend to be fairly stable over time. A street segment that is low crime one year is most likely to be low crime the next year. But that said, we do observe some changes. And what's important here is that changes at a small proportion of microplaces can have a really big effect on a city's overall crime level. So imagine, for example, you have really sharp declines at a small proportion of hotspots. That's going to have an outsized impact on city level crime trends. Okay, so how have we tried to make sense of this relationship between crime and place? The study of crime and place is largely focused on two theoretical mechanisms from criminological theory. So the first is informal social control. If I have any criminology or criminal justice majors in the audience, think social disorganization, collective efficacy, things like that. So these are sort of the range of actions taken by ordinary people to signal that behaviors are acceptable. So areas that have strong social institutions and interpersonal networks among residents, they're going to be more cohesive, and folks there are going to intervene for the common good, and that's going to keep crime down. Now, again, traditionally, we have sort of thought about this at the neighborhood level, but more recently, researchers like Groff and Weisberg really made the case that if we're focused on social interaction and cooperation among folks, it might be more relevant to look at things at smaller units of analysis where you have more familiarity among residents. So the second of these mechanisms is criminal opportunity. Again, for my criminal justice majors, think routine activities, rational choice, situational crime prevention. So criminal opportunity is assumed to be high when people who are motivated to commit crime believe they can do so with really little effort and risk, and that they can attack rewarding targets without much consequence. And so perceptions of criminal opportunity are going to be shaped by the characteristics of places, including their environmental design, their users, their functions, how effectively they're managed. Okay, so that's sort of the theoretical perspective by which we approach this work. So given what we know from criminological theory and research on crime and place, what does this mean for crime prevention? Well, first of all, it suggests that targeting microplaces will be a more effective and efficient way to allocate those scarce prevention resources. And in particular, we should focus on interventions that have the potential to increase that informal social control or reduce criminal opportunity. Sort of the most prominent example of this we see is hotspots policing, which, when successfully implemented, really shows the viability of targeting these smaller spatial scales for prevention. But we question with our work, might there also be some non-policing place-based approaches? And these might be really well suited to addressing those underlying criminogenic conditions of microplaces. And so that's the focus of our work. So what do we see? Is there some evidence for place-based improvements? A lot of this work has been done sort of at what we call the meso level. So community level efforts targeted at the neighborhood level. So there's been research that's linked crime reductions to mortgage lending, urban revitalization, so on and so forth. More recently, we are seeing some research being done at the micro level. So for example, a study published this year looking at the effects of Philadelphia's Basic Systems Repair Program, which provided small grants, less than $20,000, to low-income homeowners to make structural home repairs. And they found that, blocks with houses that received these funds had about a 22% decrease in crime. So suggests it is promising. So with our work, we're interested in, can place-based improvements explain year-to-year changes at street segments within cities over time? Again, given that we know crime tends to cluster at relatively few places, it tends to be stable over time, is it possible to produce change? And so we're going to look at two mechanisms for place-based improvements. The first is code enforcement. And so civil code enforcement is really meant to gain compliance with rules, regulations, and laws, and it can be used by local governments to eliminate public nuisances and maintain public health and safety. And so some scholars, including Eck, have argued that taking this more regulatory approach for crime control that focuses on property owners offers some potential benefits. So for one, it transfers responsibility and costs of crime reduction away from the taxpayer to those who might be creating the conditions for crime. It's also possible that you'll have longer term crime reductions if you're able to address those underlying criminogenic conditions. You're relying less on criminal sanctions, which can be really costly. And so, that's one thing we look at here. The other one is this idea of building permits. So building permits represent investment in properties. They're required for new construction and demolition, as well as making substantial renovations and improvements to existing properties. And so there's lots of examples of why one would need to pull a permit for a project. But again, it's all associated with really investing in property. So what does this look like in terms of how we expect these relationships to play out for what we know about crime in place? One is that, code enforcement investment, as I just said, is either going to incentivize or even compel or coerce place-based improvements. But how does this relate to what we know about the mechanisms that produce crime in space? Well, for one, strengthening neighborhood and housing and economic infrastructure might increase residents willing to intervene for the common good. It increases that informal social control. We also suspect that it could reduce criminal opportunities. So we view property owners and those who are tasked with place management as rational actors. And so as they make greater investments in their property, they are going to be more incentivized to address underlying conditions that create opportunities for crime. And that can have an impact on, for example, property values and things like that. And so our study comes from the perspective of, there's already a lot of policies out there that encourage development and investment activity in disadvantaged communities, many of which have high crime rates. And yet, as we talked about earlier, there's a lot of within neighborhood variability in crime, even in those high crime communities. And so we're interested in whether perhaps such policies should be more targeted and focused. Can targeted place-based improvements reduce crime? This really responds to calls to supplement our criminal justice system intervention with some non-criminal justice approaches to enhance public safety, acknowledging that law enforcement shouldn't bear the sole responsibility of making cities safe. And in fact, there's a lot of other things going on in cities that can be, partnered with law enforcement to help produce crime reduction benefits. So we approach this by examining the relationship between code enforcement, building permits, and yearly changes in crime at street segments from 2008 to 2018, using data from 6 large cities. So we look at Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, San Antonio, where I'm located, and Seattle, where my colleagues are located. The only exception is San Antonio, where data were limited to 2008 to 2016. So our unit of analysis is consistent with work that's been done in this area. We look at the street segment. So this is the length of a street until it intersects another street and includes properties and events that occur on both sides. And so this is really consistent again with this idea that there's a lot of street to street variability within communities. We're also going to be interested in the influence of nearby locations. And so we consider the potential effects of place-based improvements at crime on nearby street segments. So one common concern anytime we do some sort of crime prevention strategy is that any gains we make through our prevention efforts are simply going to be lost through displacement. So if you're not familiar with the term, displacement is when a particular crime that appears to be prevented is just shifted to another time, place, and or victim. So in other words, the potential offenders adapt, right? So research suggests that displacement doesn't always occur, and when it does, it's not 100%, meaning even if you do observe displacement, it's usually a fraction of what was actually prevented. And yet research also suggests that opportunity reducing strategies can produce what we call diffusion of benefits. So that's when, for example, let's say we have a crime prevention strategy targeting a specific street segment. The surrounding street segments also enjoy that prevention benefit. And so, as you can imagine, the extent to which there's displacement or diffusion of benefits as the result of a crime prevention strategy has enormous implications for the merit of the strategy. We don't want to be using our time and resources to simply move dots around a map, right? We want to make sure we're actually reducing crime and not just pushing crime problems to other areas. So this slide just sort of briefly summarizes our data sources, but I'll talk about them all in a little more detail. We have crime data from the police departments of all the cities. Code enforcement and building permit data come from the building departments. And then we also control for other elements of the built environment. So we have zoning and land use data from Zillow. Like I said, I'll talk about all these in a little more detail. So we use crime incident data, and the main models I present will be on total crime, but we're also interested in whether the relationships we observe might be driven by specific crime types, right? Might it be that violent or property crime, for example, are particularly susceptible, to place-based interventions. And so we'll also report some of those crime type specific findings. We received code enforcement data at the address level, and so we aggregated those annually, those citation counts, to the nearest street segment. And as I discussed earlier, they're issued to property owners when city compliance officers receive a complaint or witness violations around a range of issues. And obviously, city priorities and capacities vary, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, and how they administer code enforcement. The building permit data also came to us at the address level, and so we aggregated those annually to the nearest street segment. And again, it captures a range of investments in the built environment. These permits do tend to represent capital investments rather than just routine maintenance. And just recognize that larger projects likely require several permits. And so the assumption here is more permits are going to be represent more dollars invested in an area. But again, we'll talk about some of the measurement issues at the end and ways we're hoping to improve upon this moving forward. And then again, we do control for some of the built environment. So in terms of land use, we measure whether a street segment, the properties on it are completely commercial, industrial, residential, or if it's a mixed use street segment. And then we also account for vacant lots on the segment. So this slide highlights sort of the spatial distribution of crime across cities. And so here along the y-axis, we have the percent of street segments. And then down here, we've graphed the percentage of crimes that fall there. And so let's start here with San Antonio, where I live. Over the study period, so in San Antonio, it's 9 years. The other cities, it's 11 years. 9 years of crimes in San Antonio, 50% of those crimes came from just 3.4% of street segments. Over an 11-year period, about 5% of crimes in Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York City, 50% of crimes in Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York City came from just about 5% of street segments, right? We've also graphed, 75% of crimes and 90% of crimes. So about 31% of street segments in San Antonio accounted for 90% of all crimes over the study period. So this is fairly consistent with what we see in the crime in place literature. We do see some cross-city differences, but still a small proportion of segments are accounting for a good deal amount of crime. I won't go into a ton of detail here, but we can always answer questions after. We did transform the crime, building permit, and code enforcement variables in the analysis to count for skewed distributions and the substantial proportion of zeros. And so what this IHS transformation does is it's similar to a log transformation to adjust for skewness, but it also allows us to retain zeros. And so for those who are interested in interpreting coefficients, a 1% increase in the IHS transformed independent variable corresponds with X% change in the IHS transformed dependent variable. Again, we can talk about that more for those who are interested. So we investigate the impact of changes in code enforcement citations and building permits on year-to-year changes in crime on street segments. Our modeling includes block group and census tract by year fixed effects. So what this does is it allows us control for omitted variables, things that might be related to both our independent variables and our dependent variable. And so the use of the fixed effects is supported by the Hosman specification tests in all 6 cities. And again, for those who are interested in the modeling, we can talk about that more at the end, but I want to make sure we have time to get to really the results and the implications here. As I mentioned earlier, we're also interested in the effects of nearby locations. We want to make sure we're not just moving dots around the map on our crime maps, right? And so we use a spatial Durbin model that allows us to include a spatial lag of both the dependent variable and independent variables. And so we created a spatial weights matrix based on all intersecting neighbors for each street segment. And again, this is supported by likelihood ratio tests in all 6 cities. So this is what our modeling strategy looks like. You can see we control for crime in the previous year, and we're using last year's permits, last year's enforcement citations, vacant lots, land use. And then we also include variables for the values of each street segment's immediate spatial neighbors, right? So, permit activity, code enforcement citations, vacant lots and land use. And then right here, you can see, let's see over here, the block group fixed effect and the census tract by year fixed effect. And we cluster the standard errors at the census tract by year level. All right, so this is a lot. So I just want to highlight a few things. Let's first focus on the effects of code enforcement. So what we see here is essentially a negative and statistically significant relationship across all 6 study cities. In other words, as code enforcement increases, it's associated with a statistically significant reduction in crime the subsequent year. Now, as you can see, we do see some differences in the coefficient size across cities. So the relationship is stronger in some cities than others, but it is negative and statistically significant across all study cities. Similarly, when we look at the effects of building permits, we see statistically significant negative relationships across all cities. Interestingly, the cities that had the strongest effects of code enforcement have weaker effects of building permits and vice versa. We're also interested again in this idea of possible displacement or diffusion of benefits. So what happens when nearby street segments have code enforcement? What we see again is a negative and statistically significant relationship across all cities. So in other words, when a street segment experiences more code enforcement, adjacent street segments also experience reductions in crime. Now you'll notice the coefficient sizes are substantially smaller. So I would call that sort of a modest diffusion of benefits. You don't get the same effect that you see on the focal street segment. And the same is true when we look at the effect of neighbors' building permits. Again, statistically significant and negative across all cities, with the exception of Seattle. So just to draw your attention to a couple other findings, this crime lag is last year's crime. You can see it's positive and statistically significant across all cities. This really is highlighting the stability of crime over time at place. Likewise, vacant lots are positive and statistically significant across all cities, more vacant lots associated with more crime. In terms of land use, relative to street segments that are wholly residential, those that are commercial and those with mixed use land use have more crime, whereas industrial sort of more of a inconsistent relationship across cities. Now, as I mentioned, we're also interested in crime type specific effects. And so what this table does is just summarize the effects across the 6 cities for violent property disorder and other crimes, the relationship with code enforcement. So as you can see, we have significant effects for all crime types across all cities. But interestingly, the effect is strongest for property crime, and that's consistent for all 6 cities, followed by violent crime. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but really it seems that code enforcement has the biggest impact on property crime. When we look at the crime type specific effects of building permits, we see a similar story. The effects are strongest for property crime, followed by violent crime. And again, this is consistent across all 6 cities. So to summarize, our findings show that two mechanisms, for place-based improvements, public regulation in the form of code enforcement and private investment in the form of building permits, were significantly associated with reductions in crime at street segments over time in all 6 cities. The effects were strongest for property crime and then violent crime. And so this suggests that these types of crimes might be particularly susceptible to crime opportunity and informal social control that accompanies place-based improvements. We did not observe any evidence of immediate spatial displacement. And again, we kind of limited that investigation to spatial displacement at nearby locations. But instead, what we observed was moderate diffusion of benefits. Again, immediate spatial neighbors also experienced a negative association with the code enforcement and building permit activity. We did observe some cross-city differences, and this is something we intend to explore with future research. Some explanations we're thinking about are, differences in the regulatory environments, development pace, population growth in these cities. For example, there's some research that shows that coastal markets are generally more highly regulated. And so thinking about the different city processes, procedures, and priorities for code enforcement might help explain some of this. But what does this mean for crime prevention? We think our findings suggest that we should extend micro-scale intervention to include policies that incentivize and even compel investment at high crime microplaces. These interventions could serve multiple goals, including improved public safety, economic development, as well as physical and mental health. Like I mentioned earlier, there's some findings showing that crime hotspots have, really bad outcomes on both physical and mental health. Now, policies do exist that incentivize and coerce place-based improvements, but they often target larger spatial scales. And so we think that there really is an opportunity to capitalize on existing programs and resources by prioritizing efforts at smaller spatial scales, right? So every city that's in our study, as well as lots of other cities in the United States, have programs that target community and economic development investment, but rarely do these have an explicit goal of crime reduction, and they don't often measure that outcome, right? And so our results suggest that leveraging these existing initiatives for crime prevention could yield additional public benefits. And so we think that maybe the criteria for some of these programs or initiatives should also consider, public safety outcomes. And so what would that involve? Municipal and community and economic development officials, should partner with law enforcement analysts to sort of better understand crime hotspots in cities. We also think we should challenge this idea of meso-level planning and recognize that there's a lot of within neighborhood differences, and understanding those dynamics will allow us to have more impact when we allocate scarce resources. Another thing to think about, like the code enforcement piece, there has been some recent research published by Lee and colleagues just this year coming out of Cincinnati, showing that the importance of place management and producing crime at microplaces. And so it might be the case that intervening with property owners who own multiple high crime properties within cities might be particularly efficient. And so thinking about how to use code enforcement in a really strategic way. So what's next? Our research team has submitted a proposal to CINA for continued funding to further explore these spatiotemporal crime patterns using these data and new data that we're looking to collect. I'll describe some of our ideas, but if there's anyone here from DHS in the audience who would like to partner with us to develop additional research questions that would be useful to you, we certainly welcome your ideas. Our goal is always for our research to be helpful. But to give you an idea of where we see this agenda going. So one strength of our study is that we do use data from 6 cities, but not all cities provide the same level of detail with respect to permit activity and code enforcement. And so some of the cities have this information. And so we want to do sort of a deeper dive on how to measure these things, types of permits, dollar value associated with them. In terms of code enforcement, are there particular types of violations? Can we get at whether there was general compliance or not? And so we want to look at some of those things because we think it might help reveal more nuanced relationships that will help us understand how these things can produce crime prevention benefits. So the other thing we're interested in is the idea of how place-based improvements might interact with other factors to influence crime patterns. So there is prior research that suggests microplace characteristics don't uniformly influence crime patterns. Instead, they do interact with other factors. So we published a study earlier this year that showed that place types that we often think of as crime generators, so bars, liquor stores, convenience stores, they're more strongly related to crime at street segments in neighborhoods with high levels of concentrated disadvantage and vehicular traffic. These same place types are less criminogenic when they're located in blocks and communities with high levels of civic engagement. So where folks, are more likely to be involved in their communities. And so we're really interested in what factors might amplify or depress the crime reductive benefits of regulation and economic investment at microplaces. And so things like the presence of specific place types and street segment and neighborhood characteristics. How do these things interact with place-based improvements to produce crime patterns? And so we'll answer these questions using 2 address level data sources, Data Axle's consumer data and business data, as well as data from the US Census Bureau's 5-year American Community Survey estimates. But again, if anyone has other ideas of how these data might be useful for you, we certainly are interested in those ideas. So to wrap up, our interdisciplinary work here in criminology, real estate, and urban planning, we think can benefit DHS and its partners, including local government and the private sector. As you all are aware, the federal government and elected officials are considering major investments in infrastructure and community redevelopment. And so having answers to questions about the role of urban development to enhance community outcomes, including public safety outcomes, we think is really important. And so this is where our research offers DHS and other law enforcement agencies an opportunity to provide guidance in these discussions, right? To their public and private partners about how to strategically invest in communities in ways that will yield the greatest public safety benefit. And there is some research showing, including some of our own that's coming out, is that once you do start dealing with crime problems, that does attract additional private investment. And so we're thinking that can then spur additional private investment for sustained economic growth. And as always, we drew on the research and great ideas of others working in this area. So these slides will be made available for anybody who wants to dig into this research. But for now, we invite your questions. Thank you very much.